Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Moving Beyond Child Poverty to Promote Family Economic Wellbeing. I've seen the preview and you're in for a treat. I'm Lena Guzman, the Chief Strategy Officer at Child Trends. For those of you who may be less familiar with Child Trends is the nation's leading nonpartisan research organization focused exclusively on improving the lives and prospects of children, youth, and their families. Today's webinar is co-sponsored by the University of Michigan's Poverty Solution, whose mission is to partner with community stakeholders and policymakers to find what works in confronting poverty and to use that evidence to be part of a positive change in communities. Before we get started on the content, I have a few housekeeping items. First, if you experience audio problems, you can dial in. If you have any technical or you need technical support, please feel free to use the chat feature and that will alert my colleague, Megan Trainin, or you can send her an email and we'll be pasting in her email in the chat. Last, we welcome your questions and encourage you to submit them through the webinar using the Q&A feature. We're not going to be having a live Q&A session during the webinar, but we will be responding to your questions in real time via the chat. Audience members are going to be muted throughout to ensure a smooth audio experience for everyone. And we're also going to be recording the webinar and we'll be sending that out to all who have registered for the event. So last week, the Census Bureau, as many of you know, released the latest figures on the state of poverty for children in our country. And the news was not good. Child poverty increased from 5.2% in 2021 to 12.4% in 2022. That means that more than 5 million more children were in poverty in 2022 than during the height of the pandemic in 2021. This increase was not unexpected, and it was preventable. The increase followed the expiration of most of the COVID-era programs that resulted in the unprecedented reductions in child poverty. New census numbers reiterate the critical lessons that we learned from the report that my colleagues at Child Trends put out last year, namely that we have the policy tools to reduce child poverty in this country. But that's not where our work ends. Poverty rates are an important indicator of family well-being, but they're only one among many. And with that in mind, our webinar today has two objectives. First, to have a conversation about the extent to which child poverty trends are or are not in sync with other indicators of family well-being, and two, to push the conversation forward about what a social safety net needs to look like to not only move children above the poverty threshold, which is a necessary first step, but also to more holistically focus on child and family well-being. So to do this, we're going to have three parts of the webinar. First, we're going to share trends over the last 25 years in child poverty and what we've learned from that. Each of our panelists will share their perspectives on the relationship between child poverty and other indicators of economic well-being. And then we're going to have a moderated discussion about what this means for building a social safety net that's focused more holistically on child and family well-being. And finally, we're going to close it out. So let me go ahead and start introducing our panelists. I mentioned that you're all in for a treat, and you are. Beginning with my colleague, Renee Rieberg, who co-leads the child poverty work. She's also joined by Luke Schaefer, who is a leading scholar of poverty and a professor at the University of Michigan and the director of their Poverty Solutions Institute. Luke also just released a new book called The Injustice of Place, and I highly recommend it to all. We also have with us today our former Child Trends alumni, Lillian Singh, who is now the Senior VP of Family Economic Mobility at Share Our Strength, where she leads the organization's initiative to address structural inequalities that create, sustain, and perpetuate food insecurity and persistent poverty. Joining us is also Raquel Hatter, who is the Managing Director of Human Services Program at Kresge Foundation and the former Commissioner of the Tennessee Department of Human Services. And last but not least is Katie Beckman, who is a Program Officer at the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, where she leads efforts to protect and advance policies and systems that support the health, the well-being, early learning, and economic opportunities for young children and families. And prior to joining the foundation, Katie served as a senior policy advisor for early childhood health in the Administration for Children and Families at the Department of Health and Human Services. So before I turn it over to Renee, I want to share a little bit about why this work matters so much to me, both personally and professionally. If we went back in time, I would be one of those children, and my family would be one of those families reflected in the data that we're going to be talking about today. My parents and I came to the US in the 70s. The economy wasn't necessarily strong when we arrived, but my father was able to get a job with a union. And my mom got a pink collar job, both of which provided my family steady income and benefits. And like many of the children that are represented in the numbers and stories we're going to be sharing with you all today, my family benefited from my grandmother's Social Security checks and the food stamps that my mother only let my father use in the supermarkets that were far away from our neighborhood. And it's that combination of secure jobs with benefits and my grandmother's support in those early years that allowed us to be solidly above the poverty line. Not a lot, but above. We also had a lot of luck and at times relied on the generosity of our friends and family. Soon after my parents, for example, bought our house, we were hit with an IRS audit and that resulted in a fine. But their entire savings had gone into the down payment for the house. And this was literally months after we bought the house. So fortunately, my parents were able to borrow money from a family friend. If they hadn't, I don't know what would have happened. And when I look back, I really am in awe both of what my parents accomplished, but I also see how precarious my family's hold on economic security was in those early years. And surely there has to be a better way. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Renee.
Thank you, Lena. I'm going to take a step way back for a minute to situate child poverty in a historical context. So this graph shows child poverty rates as measured by the Supplemental Poverty Measure from 1967, when we started measuring poverty as a country, through 2019, just before the pandemic. So if you look at the right half of this graph, you can see that from about 1993 to 2019, our country experienced a huge decline in child poverty. This is on the magnitude of more than a 50% reduction. Now, if we extend this graph to include the pandemic, we see something really remarkable. This decline in child poverty continued through 2020 and 2021, and child poverty hit a record low of 5.2% in 2021, largely due to investments in temporary supports, including stimulus payments made directly to families, as well as expansions to the child tax credit. But in 2022, those pandemic supports started to expire, and we saw child poverty rates shoot right back up to where they were before the pandemic. So even though we saw this huge increase in child poverty this past year with the expiration of the pandemic era social programs, in a historical sense, child poverty rates are still relatively low. But that doubling, literal doubling, of child poverty in 2022 shows that this progress is at risk. And this reiterates the main story of our report that we released last year, examining the decline in child poverty up until the pandemic. We have powerful tools to prevent child poverty when we have the political will to use them. And one of those powerful tools is our social safety net. This grew considerably over the last 25 years before the pandemic, and this graph visually illustrates that growth. The blue line on the bottom is the actual child poverty rate as measured by the Supplemental Poverty Measure, and the purple line on top is what child poverty rates would have been if the social safety net did not exist. So in 1993, these two lines were pretty close together. The social safety net reduced child poverty by a pretty modest 9%, protecting 2 million kids from living in poverty. By 2019, the social safety net had grown in size, and there was a much wider gap between those two lines. In 2019, the social safety net reduced child poverty rates by 44% and protected 6.5 million kids from living in poverty. So the number of kids protected from living in poverty by the social safety net more than tripled between 1993 and 2019. And this grew even more with the stimulus payments in 2020 and the expansions to the child tax credit in 2021. So in brief, what we found when we looked at this historic reduction in child poverty leading up to and through the pandemic is a remarkable success story. But there are also challenges that still need to be addressed in order to not further undermine the progress that we've made over these past 30 years. And I'm going to focus on 3 of those challenges. First, there are ongoing challenges of equity and who is likely to experience poverty as a child. Second, deep poverty, living on less than half of the federal poverty line, looks different. And third, while the social safety net has been hugely influential in reducing child poverty, both before and through the pandemic until 2022, it does not necessarily lead to economic stability or well-being. I'm going to dive into each of these in turn. So first up is this challenge of equity. From 1993 to 2019, child poverty rates declined at similar rates for nearly all subgroups of children. So whether we look by parental nativity, by child race and ethnicity, or by family structure, we see remarkably similar declines in child poverty. That seems like a great success. However, this is a big however, this means that disparities that existed in 1993 between these groups persisted despite this historic decline in child poverty. So throughout this entire time period, children in immigrant families, Asian, Hawaiian, Pacific Islander children, Black children, and Hispanic children, as well as children in single-parent families, have been at an elevated risk of living in poverty. And what's even worse is that our social safety net, our current social safety net, does not work equally well for all groups of children. Specifically, we found that this pre-pandemic social safety net that we're actively reverting back to as pandemic policies expire, it tends to work better for children in non-immigrant families than children in immigrant families. It tends to work better for Black and white children than for Asian, Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and Hispanic children. And it tends to work better for children in families with stably employed parents than children who do not have a stably employed parent. This means that the social safety net actually makes existing disparities worse by family immigration status, by child race and ethnicity, and by parental employment stability. Let me say that again. The social safety net that we're reverting back to by allowing those pandemic era policies to expire exacerbates existing disparities in who experiences poverty as a child. All right, our second challenge is around deep poverty. To give you a concrete sense of who we're talking about, this is a family of 4, 2 parents living with 2 kids, trying to survive on less than about $15,000 a year. And here, the big difference is that the social safety net has not grown to protect, to increase its protection for kids living in deep poverty. So here again, we see actual deep child poverty rates in blue on the bottom and what they would have been without the social safety net in purple. Now you can see that the space between these 2 lines is huge. This indicates that the social safety net has consistently played an important role in protecting children from living in deep poverty. In 1993, the social safety net reduced deep child poverty rates by about 62%. And in 2019, this was pretty similar at 66%. So overall, the social safety net's role in reducing deep child poverty rates has not grown very much at all. This is in stark contrast to what we saw with child poverty. So up until the pandemic, the US made really little progress in strengthening the social safety net for children with the least resources. All right, turning to the third challenge. I've emphasized up to now how important the social safety net has been in reducing child poverty, both leading up to and through the pandemic. But the social safety net does not necessarily provide economic stability. So reductions in child poverty are definitely a success. We need to keep in mind that the poverty line was designed to quantify the minimum amount of resources a family needs to meet their basic needs. Many argue that that line is just way too low. So we wanted to look at how far above the poverty line the social safety net moves children. So this graph focuses on the 6.5 million children who were lifted out of poverty by the social safety net in 2019. Keep in mind that this is essentially the same safety net that we're reverting back to as pandemic aid expires. So in 2019, the poverty line for a family of 4, 2 adults, 2 kids was about $29,000 a year. On average, before taking the social safety net into account, children and families who the social safety net lifted above that line, they originally had an income of about $19,000. This is equivalent to about 65% of the poverty line. Then after taking into account the cash value of social safety net programs, this average family would have about $37,000 in resources, or be at about 130% of the poverty line. Now, this is a huge boost in resources, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that family is economically stable. This family is still considered low income by all standard definitions, and will likely continue to struggle to meet their basic needs. So like Lena said, the poverty line and the corresponding way that we measure a family's economic resources is just one way to think about how families are faring economically. It's not the whole picture. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Luke, who's going to discuss some additional ways to think about family economic well-being.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you, and I really appreciate Child Trends, who's been a wonderful partner in this, putting this together and inviting us to come together. Next slide. So in recent years, there's been a lot of debate about how to measure child poverty, and I've come to the conclusion that as long as we have scholars and researchers, we will have debates about how to measure child poverty. The answer to these questions have huge implications, and it turns out measuring poverty is incredibly difficult and requires many, many decisions. So our unemployment rate is based on 2 survey questions, and the federal government releases 6 different kinds of unemployment rates. To measure poverty, we have dozens upon dozens of questions, and are in a debate about what is the one right way to measure poverty. And we have to make many decisions. For example, our supplemental poverty measure, which I think everyone agrees does a better job of highlighting the strengths of the safety net, does things like cashing out the value of free and reduced price lunch for children who are receiving it at schools and imputing that into the incomes of families. It makes a certain sense, but I think there's also a good argument to be made about how cash is different from some in-kind benefits. So pretty much any way that you do the supplemental poverty measure indicates that child poverty fell dramatically between 1993 and 2019. A lot of thinking has been put into the measure of poverty, and that's where we are. But I began to wonder, how does that square with other markers of economic well-being for children? Do we see the same types of improvements? If we see big declines in child poverty, would we expect to also see commensurate big declines in food insecurity or housing hardship, maybe debt, if people have more of the resources they need? So this set of slides I'm going to show you is not the end-all be-all. It's not a definitive set of things, but I wanted to try to complement our current poverty measure with a set of other indicators that I think we would think, at least I think, are related, and see how they all came together. Why don't you go ahead 2 more slides? You can go 1 more. Yeah, perfect. So one thing that I think when a lot of us think about poverty, we think about access to social services. So we might expect that if we saw a big decline in child poverty, that we would see a commensurate decline, or at least some decline in families seeking out help. We have one series from the same data set that we get our child poverty rates that asks families, did you seek out help at food pantries? And over the period of time that we have those data, we see that the share of families with children seeking out help at food pantries rose by 18.6%. During the same period that one of our primary measures of child poverty fell by 34.8%. And you can also see sort of a pretty stark contrast in terms of what we think happened during the Great Recession years that started in about 2008 and really go through 2015, 2016, where we see a big spike in families seeking out food pantries, whereas our child poverty rate is staying stable. Go ahead to the next slide. I don't like to just use survey data because reporting may be an issue. So there's this really neat set of data called the Human Needs Index that's been released between 2004 and 2019. It's based on Salvation Army service data. During the year that that's available, we see that this Human Need Index rose by 23%. That's actually pretty close to what our food pantry change in the slide I just showed you from a completely different source of data suggests. And over those same years, the SPM child poverty rate fell by 31%. So this isn't specific to families with children, but we know that they're super overrepresented among those who are seeking out help. Next slide, please. Another source of data that's become available over the last decade or so has been a count of homeless children according to the nation's public schools. So again, I'm trying to use lots of different kinds of data that all have their own shortcomings, but give us a lot of different sense of advantage. And we can see for the data, the years that data are consistent, that the number of homeless children, according to our public schools, grew by 74%. During the same years that our child poverty rate would say that child poverty fell by roughly a third. Next slide. Here's food insecurity. So this is using the same kind of data that our child poverty rate came from, but asking different questions that try to get at, are families able to put enough food on the table? So over the years that we have consistent data, food insecurity does fall by 15.5%. And I think that's something we can celebrate. The decline in child poverty, according to the anchor child poverty rate, is more than twice as large. So there's a bit of a difference in terms of the success that we might think of if we were to look at these two different trends, and they look pretty different, right? We can once again see the spike that's happening during the Great Recession that doesn't happen in our child poverty numbers. Next slide. Next slide. If we think about debt as getting at this sort of great question Renee offered, should we be thinking about economic stability? Does our decline in child poverty reflect improvements in the economic well-being? We might think that families could be paying down their debt as during the years if resources are growing. We see between 1989 and 2019, though, that non-mortgage debt, we think of mortgage debt as a positive thing, but non-mortgage debt actually rises by about 200% after accounting for inflation during the same years that child poverty fell by 50%. Next slide. And finally, some of that may be a reflection of housing hardship. So this is another standard measure that's reported every year. We can go between 1991 and 2019, the share of low-income households that are housing cost burden. This is according to their cash income, but families really can only spend cash on their housing. That housing cost burden rises by 40% during the same years that the SPM child poverty rate falls by 56%. Next slide. So if we get back to what I think of as like the central question, right? Are our kids doing better than they were 30 years ago? And we're looking at this period, 1993 to 2019. Where I come down is that child poverty, it's an important metric for understanding the economic well-being of children. But I think we need to do a lot more to understand what it means for child poverty to fall over the course of a set of years when more families with children are seeking out help at food pantries and social service agencies. More public school students are being reported as not having stable housing. Food insecurity follows a very different path and falls quite a bit less than child poverty. Non-mortgage debt is growing significantly. There's a rise of families experiencing housing burden. Next slide. Now, let's contrast that to what happened between 2019 and 2021. So Renee did a great job of talking about the incredible safety net enhancements that happened during that period of time. And we all celebrated a big decline in child poverty in 2021. I was one of those people. But maybe if it followed a similar path to the previous years where child poverty reductions weren't accompanied by other things, we would think differently. So what happened to all the other metrics that we can follow? Well, in 2021, if we're comparing that to 2019, right? So this is like the impact of the COVID safety net. In 2021, food insecurity for families with children falls to its lowest level. Checking account balances grew well above their pre-pandemic level. The fraction of families reporting they were doing okay financially hits the highest level it was ever reported at. The fraction of families reporting they could cover a $400 emergency crisis hits its all-time high. These things only go back for a decade, but still like the highest levels ever. According to administrative data, eviction filings fall well below their pre-pandemic level. And my favorite is that the number of Americans with bad credit fell to an all-time low. So I feel safest when there's lots of different kinds of data. And I think here we can see the incredible impact of the safety net. So I'm going to turn it over to Lillian to talk more about that.
Thank you, Luke. I'll frame the conversation. Thank you so much also, Child Trends, for inviting me. I am that alum. I started my career at Child Trends, so I'm excited to be back in community with all of you and those who are participating virtually with us today. The framing for the slides you're going to see are really all about some of the work that our organization did as it relates to trying to hold the line during that moment, that season, very short-lived, where we thought that we could walk alongside other national organizations to defend child tax credits. One of the things that I'll say also is what we saw last year with the child tax credit policy not being extended federally, and the data that just came out that we just spoke about 2 weeks ago, arguably child poverty is a policy decision. I'll also just share, for me, childhood poverty is also an economic policy solution. As a daughter, similar to Lena, that benefited, right, from these social safety net programs. And I just wonder what my life would have been like had childhood, the child tax credit had extended. I show up to you with you all avenging for national organizations across the country. Share Our Strength is a national organization that support other organizations to be excellent. So my conversation and my dialogue quickly is just going to really refer to how we shared our strength as a national organization to support those who are already on the front lines, really trying to hold the line around national federal child tax credits through our advocacy work and through our support of them as direct service providers. And what we saw, those organizations needed in community to be effective, and what they needed in order to actually advance advocacy. And before I continue, I'll also say that while we did not win the federal fight around extending the child tax credit, we as an organization, along with other incredible organizations, continue to support state level organizations, because we know in order to revert those trends, some of the trends that we just talked about, we heard Luke talk about, we heard Renee talk about, we know that cash is gold. The one thing that they didn't say, but I will say, is that the fundamental difference in the lives of families during that 2-year period is that we had unrestricted cash. Families who lived below the federal poverty line had unrestricted cash to do what they needed to do for their families. Next slide, please. So our role was to really partner across 10 states, where we collaborated with over 36 state level and direct service providers. We provided grants to them as well as technical assistance to them to support them to reach those families who were disconnected from the social safety net, child tax credit campaign, IRS, filing taxes. All of those things was really important for them to get access to that cash. And what we partnered to do is that we allowed the organizations themselves, after they were identified, state level agencies, as well as local nonprofits, who we thought were closest to the opportunity to reach families, to create their own messaging, to actually create their own events, to actually collaborate in churches, to barbershops, to laundromats, all around their local communities, because we understood that they knew exactly how to reach those families who were disconnected from the social safety net programs that Luke referred to, but also there was a need for trust to be built, that the low-income child tax credit campaign was something that was real, that was not going to pressurize them. And we spent a lot of effort actually also engaging with the immigrant community, because we understood that that was actually a community that was so farly disconnected because of some of the Trump administration policies from really truly understanding what was available to them. Next slide. And in our work and working with direct service providers, this is what we learned. So while organizations were actually advancing information around taxes, to Luke's point, those organizations then knew that they had to go to food banks. Those organizations then knew that they had to actually go work with organizations such as Catholic Charities, who was already providing utility assistance, right, to families. The organizations that we funded and we partnered with to actually advance information around child tax credit understood that they had to go to college campuses that were opening back up their doors, and to community colleges. They had to actually go beyond just regular places and anticipating that families will actually come to them. And they began to actually build bridges with other types of organizations in order to reach more and more families. So we learned, right, that by funding and partnering with child tax credit or tax credit organizations, they broadened the tent. They knew in order to actually reach families that were in deep poverty, for example, they needed to actually buy vans. They needed to go to those communities where those families were, because if they didn't do that, they were not going to reach families who were actually the furthest from the opportunity. So we had a lot of learnings during this moment. And main thing that we learned is that the food justice, economic justice, tax justice, eco silos are very, very much siloed. But families don't live siloed lives. These families who need SNAP also needed the low-income tax credit campaign, who also needed utility assistance, who also needed workforce development resources. So I think that this was a really interesting moment in the nonprofit ecosystem, where organizations who traditionally did not necessarily see themselves in other people's fields began to actually show up in those other fields. Next slide, please. So by way of success, one of the things that we were able to accomplish through those 36 partners across the country, through so many creative mechanisms, as I've mentioned, was we were able to support families and getting a return on, on the investment that was rightfully theirs. The language that we used was, this is actually hard cash. I appreciate you saying that earlier, Luke, about there is something different about an in-kind donation and having access to cash, which if we track the data, that's why a lot of families found themselves lifted above the poverty line during that moment, but still financially insecure from an economic stability standpoint. One of the things that I also want to name is so many organizations out here, in our field, the nonprofit sector, are forced to do so much with so little. Oftentimes, they're actually solving policy challenges, and they're set up to be direct service providers. And one of the things that we were able to help them to see through some of this work that we did with them is their role, their voice, and their agency. And it was so much energy around the number of tax returns, which became very pivotal for the field, which I think has had an impact now on how the IRS is seeing their role as a provider, a long-term provider of other different types of system level solutions for families. In our field, nonprofits that are on the front lines actually made a difference in helping to see how our systems were so disconnected and really serving our families. And I hope that, as we continue to fight at the state level, we're going to continue to see systemic structural changes in some of our national level agencies. Next slide. I'll just briefly say on this particular side, it refers back to what I was saying earlier. We saw an incredible amount of progress in a lot of different states that understood that while their charge was to reach families around taxes and getting them enrolled in a very, very short period of time where our ecosystem and our nonprofit sector was not necessarily set up for them to be effective, they understood that during that moment, there was an opportunity to lock arms with state level agency organizations that were providing SNAP and other types of social service resources to families. So the child tax credit work actually also helped get families enrolled in other types of systems that they were not actually currently engaged in. Next slide. I'll end the presentation here by saying one of the big shifts that we have seen in our work is these nonprofits that are on the front lines day in and day out now see themselves, as I've mentioned before, as being able to be huge contributors to really driving economic and policy change, because they know that in order to make sure that families feel whole, right, that those families aren't just above the poverty line for a season in time, there is a need for them to broaden their own tent, to increase their collaboration across sectors, to use their strength, their resources, to really support things at the state level, because that's where we see the majority of our momentum right now in this moment, so that we can actually begin to challenge the narrative around what is a safety net. Is the safety net really a net for families? And we're building in coalition right now about 12 organizations that is, I think, for the first time, moving beyond their own siloed, kind of like this is my policy niche, to trying to understand how to collectively work in service of what we call collective impact. It is not new to our field, but most recently, I think that we're seeing a tremendous amount of momentum in organizations understanding that just because we focus on healthcare policy does not mean that we can ignore education policy, because a family has to be whole. Next slide. I'll stop here, Lena.
Thank you, Lillian. I think Raquel is up next.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here and appreciate the opportunity to share with my colleagues. I thought I would say more a little bit about myself first, in the same manner that has been said previously about folks. I'm a Flintstone, born and raised in Flint, Michigan, and I come from, I would say, small beginnings, so know what it is to struggle and know what it is to struggle less. I was born in a multi-generational home with my mom and my maternal grandparents, where we moved. My mother was able to acquire a house for us in Flint when I was 8 years old. And I've been a student parent in undergrad and graduate school, and I've been a benefactor of child care assistance and SNAP. So that's contributes to every reason why I sit in this seat today. And I'm so privileged and honored to be able to share this opportunity to talk about some of the work that we do here at the Kresge Foundation. I am here at Kresge, I lead the National Human Services Program, and our vision is to create access to opportunity with a primary focus on cities to families living in cities who are experiencing poverty or low incomes, with a particular focus on racial equity and racial justice, given how it emerges as a barrier to economic success. So with human services, we operationalize or define that in terms of how we contribute to that, as we center racial equity and racial justice to advance family, social, and economic success. And so there's some key tenets, and I'll explain those, and then I'll go into some examples of what that looks like, rather than talk about it conceptually, because I think it'll build nicely on what Lillian just discussed, because we invest in many of the types of efforts she just articulated. So a central tenet for us is what many of you might know as the two-generation approach, which is really concerned about family success over time and the reality that understanding how kids and their families are progressing together, their caregivers and parents, is really important. And what that looks like is very comprehensive. It holds early childhood, post-secondary, employment, assets, economic assistance during times when families are on that journey to realize what they see for themselves as success, social capital, all those important elements, as well as emotional health and well-being as part of the frame. So that's important to us. Another piece that's important to us is as we think about the issues of racial equity and racial justice, we recognize that they're not exactly the same, but both are important, but often we see less focus on justice, which has to do with understanding or the importance of power, and then understanding where inequities or injustices originate and how that comes to be in systems and how we go back and trace that so that we go beyond the presenting problem to the origination of a problem and what contributed to that over time. So we learn about issues like the GI Bill and how certain groups, specifically people of color, were excluded from it at its inception. We learn about how historically we see when people of color and Black people in particular, when you think about community wealth and whatnot, how over time that gets undermined in very intentional ways. So we are concerned about those things. And then the public sector is really important to us because that's the system that we believe is not necessarily working in the interest of families or with families. And then community-based partners that Leon just sang about, we certainly see them as essential and most certainly see families themselves as being important in driving systems change. And in fact, I like to think about them as the active ingredient. Without them, you're not going to render a solution to whatever you're trying to solve. And so some of the examples of what we invest in include things like some of you have heard of the Magnolia Mothers Trust, led by Dr. Aisha Nyandoro in Jackson. She's known especially for the income effort. However, she runs several pilots and fellowships with moms in Jackson, and they also advance a person-driven policy agenda around TANF, tax credit, and other issues. So you see where the policy work that we invest in is driven specifically by the people most proximate on the ground and the folks who experience it directly. So it's beyond just feedback. We invest in efforts like addressing the benefits cliff. We have a couple of partners that we work with who are doing that, and some using TANF demonstration to do so. We're actually in conversations with our friend here, Dr. Luke, regarding work that he's doing here in the state of Michigan about possibilities with regard to TANF. So that's the systems play that manifests for us. And relative to the child tax credit and EITC and guaranteed basic income, we support the guaranteed income community practice that's led by the Economic Security Project. So we are tied to policy at state and federal and relentlessly preoccupied with families on the ground. And to the point that Lillian was making about community-based organizations, we don't invest in programs, we invest in organizations who have within their focus addressing the system to change it to work for and with people. So we are able to connect people in ways that they can have access to spaces that they ordinarily wouldn't, because we work closely with the federal partners as well. We also work around addressing issues like the marginalization of fathers in the system that we see as essential along the way, and also locally driven narratives in terms of how communities see themselves relative to what the national conversation is about communities. So we have several examples and other things that I'll note when we get into the second part of the conversation regarding system issues specifically.
Okay. You good, Raquel? I just want to make sure before.
Yes, I think I have more examples when we go to the next phase.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. It's such a treat to be here with these incredible champions for children and families. And I am certainly humbled by being able to be a part of this group. Just a few comments before we open into moderated discussion. I think, as Luke and Lillian and Raquel underscored, Families have comprehensive needs that require comprehensive solutions. And yet our economic policies meant to support families have been created in piecemeal fashion, and government programs are administered in silos. What that means is that many of the families that we're talking about are enrolled in one program, and they may be enrolled or eligible for another program. But it's for that reason why I fear that the recent poverty data will only get worse if there's no intervention. What that means is that the expanded CTC that expired, it impacted the same families who are just now losing Medicaid coverage under the public health emergency unwinding. And that isn't reflected in the data that we just saw. We know that more than 5.5 million people have lost coverage so far, and that's only with the data that we have. So I hate to be a harbinger of bad things to come, but I think it's something that we really need to take seriously, that these numbers are stunning in themselves, but they're not stagnant. So, I would put on the table that we really need to put children and families as part of the policymaking and implementation process. My, families' ideas of the goals of the programs that make up the safety net may be different than what the goals are currently. And my guess is that families would never create policies where the idea of deservedness is attached to who can access help. Yet that's what we do today. So I'm going to open some questions, starting with what I just talked about. What do you guys think it would mean to build a social safety net focused on economic well-being instead of poverty? How can we think about actually building wealth in addition to income?
Well,
And you guys can just jump in. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I'll get the ball rolling on that question and say, my view after looking at the evidence is like, we actually have a pretty good model in the safety net that we had during the pandemic. I think it goes back to exactly what Lillian was saying, that cash is king. So, we had lots of estimates of what would happen if you expanded the child tax credit, if you did an expansion of the child tax credit. And probably the most important thing that we did with the child tax credit was to make it fully refundable. So that gets at one of the questions that we had in the Q&A, which was the design was specifically targeted to reach the very poorest families. And because the tax credit, the child tax credit that we had before and now have again, and the earned income tax credit, important programs, programs that have a huge impact, but they leave out lots of people at the very, very bottom. That's part of what my work is about, and many others, and part of what Renee was showing us with deep poverty. So there was lots of debates. Is cash better? Is a safety net that's split across many, many different programs with many different types of eligibility that targets the specific needs, that's usually in kind or lumped into once a year? Is that better? Well, I think we've seen, what happens when child poverty is related to sort of the split apart safety net. That's a lot of in-kind stuff that's not cash in the pre-COVID era. And that is like, I'm not sure. I think those programs are critically important. I've written about a lot of them, but we didn't see the kind of improvements that we did during 2021. I mean, if you had come to me and say, I can design a set of policies that are going to improve, families' credit scores, are going to make it so they're more financially stable, are going to mean that there's the fewest number of kids reporting food insecurity that we've ever had, I think in the pre-period, we'd say, well, let's give it a shot, but we have no idea if that can actually happen. And now we've seen it. It wasn't necessarily perfect. We can debate it around the edges, but I just think broad-based programs, more often in the form of cash transfers. I think we got to have something that's monthly, so it's not all lumped into one time a year. we've shown what it can do. And so we should build on that rather than, consider it this thing that we did for a year and now we're going back, as Lillian said, to the before times.
So I'll go next if that's okay.
Great, perfect.
I think one is a fundamental paradigm shift around the conversation about a social safety net. And like what are the reasons that we require one in this country? And what exactly, if you think about a net, what is a net actually intended to do? Is it really designed so that people can move forward, or is it something that actually catches things and it's difficult to get out of it? So fundamentally, what is that? And inherent in the thinking is something is supposed to protect you from something. So by virtue of the design, there's an assumption that something is not going to be okay. And in many ways, we think there's a fundamental flaw with the family and not the system by virtue of how it's designed. So I think when you shift the paradigm and decide what we actually believe, then you're likely to come up with a different solution that is informed and driven by family. So I think that's fundamental, one thing. Also, some of the things that we're concerned about in the current, so it's a now and later strategy. I'd like to say that not just because I like the candy, but so there's the things that are present now. So families need stabilization now, but there's also a need for a system that works toward a future that families want for themselves relative to quality of life and economic success. Even after we do all we know to do in the human services system, we still have to contend with a problematic tax policy in this country that arrests the efforts that happen on this side of the equation. And so that includes everything from racial wealth gaps, what's recognized on the human services side with regard to economic assistance as assets or resource limit that are what I think of as penalties for progress, different from the idea of incentivizing families. Families don't need to be incentivized. They need barriers to be removed out of the way. I'm not unlike if you're well on your way on a trip, you pretty much know how to get there. Then you encounter a pseudo detour, if you will. That's kind of how I think about it. So really looking at all the aspects of what are the things that are in the way and the choices that we impose on families to make decisions about whether you pay your light bill or whether you buy a child a coat, whether you go to a parent-teacher conference and take off work and not get paid for it, or if you don't go and you go to work and you get paid, then be perceived by another system that thinks you don't care about your child. And those are not real choices, but policies get made based on those behaviors, how families show up who are really experiencing toxic stress on the regular, which really interferes with their ability to think about tomorrow. They can think about tomorrow, but right now it's about surviving today. And we have systems that are literally created that put that kind of pressure on families specifically. And I have several examples of how that happened. And I was just one where pre-COVID states, because I certainly led the system around food programs, they were thinking like only a child could eat at a food program, not the family in the summer. Then you're required to throw food away, knowing that a child is going home to a house that's food insecure. And I mean, this idea, what I like about this conversation is that it takes the conversation beyond the idea of child poverty to a family system. It's rare that you would find a food secure child absent a family that is food insecure. They go together. So the idea that we're not thinking about security within the context of family is important. So bravo for talking about this in a way that we're talking about families together and the choices that they're being forced to make. So I could go on in terms of the examples with regard to, for example, child support and the interaction with TANF and what happens with regard to policy choices that states make with regard to what they can keep from TANF or what they can get paid back to them. It's a policy choice. But if in fact we're invested in the net, the way we're doing it is the right way to go. I submit to you, like all of us, that this is not the way to go. And families know the solution if we choose to honor the power and agency that they have and possess.
Thank you.
I'll just co-sign just a little bit to that, Katie. Like Raquel just named, we evaluated our efforts around child tax credits with the Urban Institute. And guess what we found? We found that these families use this money to buy food was the number one thing that families use the child tax credits for, followed by paying bills. So these families are responsible. And I think about myself and what you said, Luke, is do they, the policy was incredible and transformational, in my opinion, my perspective, because it was monthly. I grew up, right, where my mom would get the EITC in January or February. We lived a good life for like 2.5 months. And that's it, right? And then after that, it was borrowing Peter to pay Paul, right? That's what it was. So to see families, and the data did not lie, just from the cohort of organizations that we partnered with, to see families make the right decisions is what families are going to do, because the mother of that child that lives in poverty, and that we'll talk about my other work at Share Strength, it really is this continuum, right? If the mother is in poverty, so are their children. But there's political will in this country that finds it okay in some ways for the family, the parental figure, to be in poverty, but for us to want to ignore that part of what is the trajectory, the continuum of supporting them. And it's easier for us to metabolize that we don't want children hungry. We don't want children in poverty. But what we know that these children live in homes. So I'll stop there because I know there's a lot of questions, but this is a fun part of the webinar.
No, Lily,
I know we can discuss this really quick. You grew up with your mom getting EITC. I was a recipient of EITC. And what we did with the money at our house is catch up, prevent a car from being repossessed. Those kind of things, because you're operating with pressure. It creates breathing room, but it doesn't change your trajectory fundamentally. But that's one part of the solution. But it's way more to it than that. And not to mention, again, single moms, fathers, under-resourced, we could go on.
Yeah. Lillian, there's something else that you said in your remarks, in that, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but basically that families did good things with this money, like that they were responsible with it. But I mean, the fact that we even have to make that argument is stunning. If we take a step back, I mean, I think to Raquel's point about changing the way we look at this, the paradigm, our policies are so paternalistic and judgmental when it comes to families who live in low-income households. We assume that they don't make the right choice.
That's right.
I mean, if we're really getting to root cause and we start to think about the causes of poverty and systemic racism and, so many things that create barriers for families, this judgment about who can make acceptable choices we got to figure out a way to get rid of that.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, and I think just adding on to that, Raquel, who I know has worked at a very high level in state government, brought up the point that like policy decisions get made all the time based on sort of the one egregious example that someone thought they saw. Sometimes they didn't even really see it, but they thought they did. And so when you have sort of this bifurcated safety net that's only focused on poor families, we can take that one stereotype and then do something that makes SNAP harder to get, or whatever it is. So the broader based approach that brings middle class families and low income families into the same policy net, right? Like a child tax credit it's just a bit more stable and maybe a little less risky with that, but it's as old as we are as a country, right? To sort of blame Americans for poverty and then make policy around that.
Yeah, Luke, can I add to that, going back to what we've been discussing? That when I was a state leader, I used to resist the idea that we had to say where people were spending money. They're no different. Everybody needs to eat. Everybody needs lights. I mean, there's nothing different. So the idea that we have to explain what someone is doing with their money is another form of big government in my mind. And so we like to talk more about the efficacy that it creates, the space in somebody's life that it creates, less so about what people did with the money, because folks make we all make very similar choices, surprisingly. People sometimes choose chicken or chocolate over a carrot. So whatever it is that we want to eat, ideally. But I think that that piece around personal responsibility is problematic. And I think that's something that we really need to really think about specifically in terms of how do we address that and resist the temptation to defend how families spend resources.
Raquel, I think the other piece of that is the idea that you can't have personal responsibility if you access some of these support programs, right? Like it is almost counter. And for me, some of these programs level the playing field, or at least they're supposed to. So you can make choices, and you can, I mean, I think we all want to have personal responsibility. It just feels like a false dichotomy. I don't know how you feel about that.
I appreciate that, Katie. I was just yesterday in New York with a partner, Chastity Lloyd. She's the president and CEO of Jeremiah Program. And she gave the example of the Pell Grant. And I'm a recipient of the Pell Grant. I don't think that I would have actually finished school or, and certainly would have not graduated from Stanford debt-free without it. And she goes, was less stigma around that type of federal safety free opportunity, right? And she's brilliant, which is why we're partnering with her as we talk about holding the line for single moms across this country. And one of the things that I would name is, if we use those same types of policies that are universal in nature, kind of, but the appeal for the deserving factor around it is different. That's one example, right, of a policy that, has since expired for, different reasons. Another thing, my coworker, Lisa Davis at Shershon, talked about non-congregate meals and the impact that had, and arguably, I would say, on decreasing food insecurity, right, for children. And, we're holding the line right now. I'm grateful for, summer EBT and, some federal legislation around. And so now we just got to avenge and help states understand how we reach more families so they can understand that literally summer EBT is cash back to you, because I'm going to still name that cash is king, cash back to kids so they can make their choices when they're not in school, which is actually getting more money back into the hands of families, because we got to remember that those kids go somewhere, right? Typically back to a low income family. Otherwise, they wouldn't qualify for it. So it's different ways in which we're able, and we're seeing some movement. But when you think about just cash in the form of a tax credit to a low income family, which is very different than that credit I get called mortgage, right? Because I'm a high end earner and I qualify and I can actually buy a house, own a house. There's a different stigma, right, around that level of a credit, because it's not poor people who get to benefit from it, necessarily. So,
you made me think about the other issue, or policy issue that we have, is the disruption of families through the mass incarceration and through child welfare systems, the history of disrupting families, particularly across BIPOC communities. And what that does, that is a showstopper to family economic well-being in this country that continues to occur. And what we have done historically is conflate poverty and neglect. And when by definition, neglect is having the means and not doing so. And whereas poverty is, you don't have the resources and can't do it. But we have historically conflated those things and use it to separate families. That's a huge policy choice in this country, is to disrupt families through means of the child welfare system and mass incarceration. And I've never seen a system there's no way you can create this unintentionally. It's so precise, it's consistent in its results, and just highly, highly effective with regard to certain groups of people not making progress in this country.
When you talked about, Raquel, the idea of a safety net, what do you do with the net? You trap people. People don't think about incarceration policies as part of the safety net, but if you think about, how have we designed the safety net? What is the purpose of it? That's a part of the whole policy ecosystem that we're a part of. I remember this NPR story I heard. A woman, I think, receiving SNAP was talking about how our criminal justice system is supposed to be set up how you're innocent until proven guilty. Our safety net system is set up that you have to prove you need support. You have to prove your deservingness. And so I think this idea of a paradigm shift, in addition to what has been said here, is one about trust, about trusting families, trusting people, that, you know, just like you would trust a millionaire who's applying for a rebate on their mortgage interest, trust somebody applying for, you know, at the other end of the income spectrum.
Hey, Raquel, we have a question in the chat about that I think is just tailor-made for the two of you. Given your roles in the federal and state government, can you say a little bit about how state and federal departments and agencies can work together to better support these integrated approaches? Because I know that was part of what you all were doing when you were serving in the state and at the federal level. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Well, there are a number of ways, and let me just say that we have some amazing partners at the federal level, and there are a lot of folks who've been there for years who are really invested in making these systems work. And so, but they're affected by the same rules and regulations as everyone else. But we worked very closely with. There's a TANF state plan that happens. There's state plans across many things, and that's where, to me, I call it a space to innovate. And there's also, I think about as maximizing on the silence within rules or within statutes. So one of the things that we would learn is, what do we have to ask candidly permission for? Where was it silent? Where you did, which I call the space of innovation, in terms of when you interact with federal partners about what you could or couldn't do, and I also co-creating with state partners and federal partners to bring them to the table early on. So we experienced a lot of innovation working closely with state partners in a number of efforts, but it has to be intentional, because the way the government is set up is in a regulative way. So it's preoccupied, not wrongly, around program integrity and the effective use of resources. However, you could follow all the rules and families aren't better on the other side of it. So that's the fundamental problem. So that's a conversation we would always have. You can get a great audit programmatically, but it doesn't mean families are well, because of it. If you go beyond, we would talk about this window of opportunity, a window of when you can feed a child, as an example. And if you fall outside of that, that becomes an issue. That's really quite problematic. I mean, it's ridiculous in many ways, and that's my own personal opinion. But literally, it would be coming together, having real conversations that would include intense fellowship, to be candid, and really looking at what are some of the specific ways that we can work together. That's one of the spaces where we did it. And even a group that's rarely talked about on TANF is the child-only TANF. It's a number of children that are on TANF, and when their family members are not. And that's a group of young people that's rarely discussed in terms on what's the vision in that regard for those individuals, and relatives raising children as well. So those are the types of things that we would work on together. And children, third grade reading proficiency are things we would work on in terms of flexibility, or when you needed to convert TANF to childcare and vice versa. All those things, and community action agencies as well. How you can leverage community service block grant and TANF, do a lot of braiding. If I think about hair braiding, but knowing how to account for every strand. So making resources work together and account for it in cost allocation plans. So it's really making a decision to, as you go about innovating, to identify the barrier, like regulatory barrier, but don't accept it, like put it in the parking lot as something that needs to be addressed, because somebody created it, so you can go about the business of making it different.
Raquel just said this great thing about the TANF state plan as a space to innovate, right? We know a lot about the TANF flexibility that can be used to shift funds away from social support and cash, but maybe there are things we can do that are positive, with TANF and really innovate. And so I'll just mention briefly the thing in my work life I'm most excited about. I'm working with Mona Hanna Atisha in Flint. And starting in January, we're going to start a program called RX Kids, which is a universal prenatal and infant cash allowance for every family in the city of Flint. So we're not doing a pilot with 100, where every family in Flint will be eligible for $1,500 during pregnancy, and then $500 a month till the child reaches 1. And so we're going to eliminate deep poverty among infants in the city. And we were able to leverage TANF dollars for this. So we used an auspices of non-recurrent short-term benefits where you can help families in an acute crisis for up to 4 months. And so TANF is going to partner with philanthropic dollars to provide that prenatal and the first 3 months payments. And then philanthropy is going to come in for the rest. And that also allows us to get at how other programs would be impacted, because by sprinkling in philanthropic dollars, we can actually waive the RX Kids benefits from other income eligibility for other programs. So it builds on the success of the child tax credit. I hope it's sort of one example of innovating with TANF dollars, and I just couldn't be more excited about it.
Well, on that note, I would love to end the conversation on a positive. So thank you, Luke. And I actually really hate to end the conversation, because this has just been so fulfilling to be able to talk with all of you. But I'd love to extend my deep gratitude to the panelists today and to Child Trends for hosting and having us. And thank all of you for joining us as well. I guess I'd love to give just one more plug for Luke's book, and that is The Injustice of Place, Uncovering the Legacy of Poverty in America. And that's written by Kathy Eden, Luke, and Timothy Nelson. Thank you so much for joining us.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.